You can learn their coffee order. You can remember the name of their childhood dog. You can text first every single time, plan every date, show up early, stay late, forgive the silence, forgive the distance, forgive the way they vanish, right when things start to feel real. And none of it will be enough. Not because you're doing it wrong, not because you are too much or not enough or somehow missing the secret formula that would finally make them stay. It will not be enough because you are competing with something you cannot see, cannot touch, and cannot outlove. You are competing with a system inside them that was built long before you ever walked into their life. And that system does not answer to you. It does not answer to effort. It does not answer to loyalty or patience or how good you are at loving someone. It answers to one thing only. And today I am going to show you exactly what that thing is, because once you see it clearly, you will never look at an avoidant the same way again. Here is the sentence I want you to sit with for a second. An avoidant is not loyal to you. They are not loyal to the relationship. They are not even loyal to their own happiness. They are loyal to their sense of control. That is the whole game. That is the entire operating system running quietly underneath every hot and cold moment you have ever experienced with them. And once you understand that, the confusion starts to lift because you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, what is wrong with me? And you start asking, what is this person actually protecting? And why does it matter more to them than I do? Let me contrast something for you, because this is where most people get it backwards. When you think about safety in a relationship, you probably think about closeness. You think about being known. You think about someone remembering the small things, checking in, wanting to be near you. That is what safety feels like to you. But to an avoidant, that exact same closeness can feel like danger, not annoyance, not mild discomfort. Danger. Their nervous system reads intimacy the way yours reads a threat, and so the very things you are offering them as love, your presence, your consistency, your emotional openness, register somewhere underneath their conscious mind as something to escape. You are not dealing with someone who dislikes love. You are dealing with someone whose body has been trained to treat love like exposure. This is why nothing you do seems to work for very long. You give more, they pull back. You give space, they still pull back, just more slowly. You get warmer, they get cooler. You get cooler to protect yourself, and suddenly they get warmer again, almost like they can sense the exact moment you stop chasing. It can start to feel like a game, like they are doing this on purpose. Like there is some cruel intelligence behind the push and the pull, but that is not what is happening. What is happening is much older than you and much older than them. Because here is the truth nobody tells you in the beginning. Avoidance is not a personality trait. It is not a preference for independence, and it is not proof that someone simply values their freedom more than they value you. Avoidance is a survival strategy. It was built, usually far too early in life, in a home where needing someone did not go well. Maybe there was a parent who could not tolerate big emotions. Maybe comfort was rare or conditional or came with a price. Maybe a child learned, long before they had the words for it, that reaching out for connection and getting nothing back hurt worse than not reaching out at all, and so that child adapted the only way children know how. They stopped reaching. They got small. They taught themselves to need less, want less, feel less, because feeling less was safer than feeling everything and getting nothing in return. That child grew up. The home changed, the danger passed, but the wiring stayed exactly the same. And now you have an adult who still, on some buried level, believes that closeness is where the pain lives. So when someone wonderful comes along, someone warm, someone who actually wants them, the alarm still goes off, because the alarm was never built to recognize good love. It was built to recognize any love, because to that old wiring, love and risk are the same word. This is the contrast you need to hold in your mind every time you feel confused by their behavior. You are operating from a system that says closeness equals safety. They are operating from a system that says closeness equals danger and independence equals survival. You cannot love someone out of a threat response using the very thing their body has learned to fear. It does not matter how much you love them. It does not matter how right you are for them. It does not matter how rare and real what you have together actually is. None of that reaches the part of them that is still quietly running from something that happened years before you. And this is where I need you to really listen, because what I am about to tell you next changes everything about how you see this dynamic, and more importantly, how you decide to move forward inside it or away from it. Because understanding where the wiring came from does not mean you are required to live inside its consequences forever. It does not mean their fear becomes your permanent assignment. It simply means you finally know what you are actually facing, instead of guessing in the dark and blaming yourself for a system you were never given the blueprint to. So let's talk about the part almost nobody names correctly, because most people call it a mind game. And it is not a mind game. It is a cycle. And once you can see the shape of it, you will recognize it instantly in your own life. Maybe with a wince, maybe with a small gasp, because this is the part that explains why leaving felt so much harder than it should have. Here's how it moves. The avoidant pulls away. You feel it immediately, that shift in temperature, the slower replies, the sudden busyness, the conversations that used to feel easy now feeling like work. And your body does what bodies do when something they are attached to starts to disappear. It panics quietly or loudly, and that panic pushes you toward action. You reach out more. You try harder. You over-explain, over-apologize, over-function, trying to close a gap that was never actually about the size of your effort. And then one of two things happens. Either they stay distant and you spiral, replaying every conversation, searching for the moment you supposedly ruined it, or they come back, they get warm again. They send the message that makes your whole chest loosen. And that moment, that exact moment of them returning feels incredible, almost disproportionately incredible, because your nervous system just went from fear back to relief in a matter of seconds. That relief is not a small thing. It is one of the most powerful feelings a human body can produce. And your brain, without asking your permission, files that moment away as evidence. Evidence that this relationship is worth the wait. Evidence that the good moments are real, even bigger than they actually are, because they are being measured against how bad the distance just felt. This is the contrast that keeps people stuck longer than almost anything else in modern relationships with a securely available partner. Love feels calm, and calm does not spike your dopamine the way relief does. But with an avoidant, love arrives in waves, distance, then closeness, fear, then reward. And your brain starts treating the unpredictability itself as chemistry. You start to confuse the intensity of the highs and lows with how right the relationship actually is. But intensity is not intimacy. A racing heart from anxiety and a racing heart from real connection can feel almost identical in the body. And that confusion is exactly what keeps so many people locked into relationships that are quietly costing them their peace. Meanwhile, the avoidant is not orchestrating any of this on purpose. I want to be clear about that again because it matters. They are not sitting there calculating how to keep you hooked. What they're doing is following their own system, closeness when it feels safe enough to risk, distance the moment it starts to feel like too much. But the effect on you is the same regardless of their intention. You end up organized entirely around their availability. Your mood tracks their mood. Your day depends on whether they reached out. Small gestures start to feel enormous because your baseline has been trained to expect almost nothing, so anything at all feels like a gift. Now here is where I want to challenge something, because this is where a lot of people quietly go wrong once they learn all of this. They learn about attachment styles, they learn about nervous systems and childhood wounds, and they think, okay, now that I understand them, my job is to be patient enough, loving enough, steady enough to finally be the one who proves it is safe. And I understand why that feels noble. It feels like compassion. But I want you to hear this clearly. Understanding where someone's fear came from does not mean you are responsible for healing it. Those are two completely different things, and conflating them is one of the most common and most costly mistakes people make when they fall for an avoidant. You can understand a person's pain without volunteering to carry it. You can have compassion for what happened to them as a child without agreeing to spend your adult life waiting outside a door they may never fully open. Real growth in an avoidant does not come from a partner who tolerates enough silence or gives enough space or stays calm through enough disappearing acts. It comes from the avoidant themselves, choosing to look at their patterns, choosing to do the work in therapy, in self-reflection, in real sustained effort. Not because someone is patiently standing by waiting for them to arrive, but because they decided on their own that they wanted something different for their life. Love is not a strong enough force to override years, sometimes decades, of a nervous system trained to treat closeness as danger. That is not a failure of your love. That is simply the limit of what love alone can do. You cannot outlove a threat response. You cannot cook your way, text your way, or wait your way into rewiring someone else's fear. And this is not meant to make you feel hopeless. It is meant to free you from a job that was never actually yours to do. Because here is the quiet tragedy underneath all of this that almost nobody talks about. The avoidant is not winning either. They might look calm. They might look like they have it all figured out, unbothered, independent, fine on their own. But underneath that composure, many avoidants carry a loneliness they have gotten so good at ignoring that they no longer consciously feel it until the room goes quiet, until there is no one left to distract them from themselves, and in that silence, something aches. That ache is the part of them that wants exactly what you want: connection, safety, to be known and chosen anyway. They are simply terrified of it in a way that runs far deeper than logic can ever reach. Now, understanding all of this is not the finish line. I know it feels like relief when the confusion finally clears, when you finally have language for what you have been quietly living inside of for so long. But insight without action just becomes a smarter way to stay stuck. And I do not want that for you. So let's talk about what actually shifts something, starting with the belief that quietly runs underneath almost every anxious avoidant dynamic, the belief that if you just give more, you will eventually get more back. Here is the contrast you need to burn into your memory. Overgiving does not build safety with an avoidant. It builds evidence. Evidence that they do not have to reach for you because you will always reach first. Evidence that they do not have to sit with discomfort because you will absorb it for them. Evidence that distance costs them nothing because you keep closing the gap every single time. And here is the part that stings the most, more than most people ever admit. This is not just ineffective. It is actively working against you. Because human beings, avoidant or not, do not build deep respect for the thing they never have to work for. The more available you make yourself at the expense of your own needs, the less there is for them to lean toward. You cannot chase someone into choosing you. Chasing only teaches them that choosing is optional. So the first shift is simple to say and hard to live. Stop outgiving the distance. When they pull back, resist the reflex to close the gap for both of you. Let the space exist. Let it be uncomfortable. not as a manipulation tactic, not as some strategic silence designed to make them chase you instead, but because constantly overriding your own instincts to manage their nervous system is slowly erasing you, one accommodation at a time. The second shift is getting brutally honest about what you actually need, not what you have quietly downgraded your needs into after months or years of adjusting to someone else's limits. This matters more than people realize, because when you love an avoidant for long enough, you start doing something dangerous without noticing. You start renegotiating your own standards in real time, telling yourself that maybe you do not need daily communication. Maybe you do not need clear plans. Maybe you do not need someone who can say, "I miss you," without flinching. You start calling your loneliness patience and your unmet needs high standards. So take a moment away from them, away from the relationship entirely, and ask yourself plainly, what do I actually need to feel secure, chosen, and calm in a relationship? Not what feels realistic given who they are, not what you think you are allowed to ask for, what you actually need. Write it down if that helps. Say it out loud if that helps more. And then, without flinching, compare that list to what is actually happening in your relationship right now. Not what could happen if they finally did the work. Not what they promised 6 months ago, but what is real today. If there is a gap between what you need and what you are receiving, that gap is not a character flaw of yours. It is information. It is one of the most important pieces of information a relationship can hand you, and you are allowed to act on it. The third shift is redirecting the energy. Think about how much of your mental and emotional bandwidth has gone toward figuring them out, toward decoding their moods, toward rehearsing conversations you might have to justify your needs, toward analyzing a text for 40 minutes before deciding whether it means what you hope it means. Now imagine putting even half of that energy back into your own life. Your friendships that have gone quiet while you were busy interpreting someone else's silence. The hobbies you let fade because your evenings became about managing their availability. Your own goals, your own body, your own peace. Something happens when you do this, and it is not a trick, it is simply true. You start to remember who you were before this relationship organized your nervous system around someone else's comfort. And paradoxically, that person who is actually living their life, who has interests and friendships and momentum that do not depend on a text arriving, becomes far harder to walk away from than the person who rearranged everything to be available at all times. The fourth shift is the hardest one, and it is this. Stop explaining yourself to someone who is not ready to hear it. There is a version of communication that is healthy, honest, direct, and there is a version that quietly turns into pleading, into justifying your right to want basic emotional consistency, into proving over and over that your needs are reasonable. If you have found yourself building a case for why you deserve to be prioritized, something has already gone wrong, because the right relationship does not require you to argue for your own worth. Real love does not make you rehearse your value like a defense attorney. It simply gives it to you without a trial. And underneath all four of these shifts is one truth that ties them together. You are allowed to let a relationship end if it does not meet your needs, even if you understand exactly why the other person struggles to meet them. Compassion for someone's pain is not the same as a lifelong obligation to absorb it. You can hold empathy for what happened to them as a child and still choose, as an adult, not to spend your one life waiting outside a door that may never open. Those two things are not in conflict. They can exist together fully, without guilt, without apology, and without you having to shrink one truth to make room for the other. So let's bring this all the way home, because there is one more contrast I need you to see clearly before we finish, the one that actually determines how the rest of your story goes from here. It is the difference between waiting and choosing. Waiting is passive. Waiting is standing still while hoping someone else eventually catches up to what you already know you deserve. Choosing is active. Choosing means you decide on your own timeline based on your own needs what kind of love you're willing to keep making room for. And the moment you shift from waiting to choosing is the exact moment this entire dynamic loses its grip on you. Because the avoidance power in this pattern has never come from how desirable they are. It has come from your willingness to keep the door open indefinitely, without conditions, without a timeline, without ever asking whether staying is actually serving you. Here is something worth saying plainly, because it rarely gets said. Real consequences change people faster than patience ever will. Not threats, not ultimatums delivered in anger, but the simple, steady truth that you are not available to be strung along forever. When an avoidant senses that someone will wait indefinitely, there is no urgency to face themselves. But when they sense that the relationship is genuinely at risk, not manipulated into feeling that way, but actually honestly at risk because you have real boundaries and real self-respect, something can shift. Sometimes that shift leads to growth. They start therapy. They start doing the real uncomfortable work you always hoped they would eventually do, not because you demanded it or begged for it, but because losing you became more frightening than facing themselves finally was. And sometimes the shift leads to loss. They let you go because the fear was simply too big, even with everything on the line. Both outcomes, and I really want you to hear this clearly, both outcomes give you clarity. One tells you clearly they were capable of meeting you. The other tells you mercifully that they were not, and frees you from years of wondering. But here is the deeper work underneath all of this, the work that matters even more than what happens with them. If you keep finding yourself in this exact dynamic, again and again, different face, same pattern, it is worth turning the question inward instead of only outward. Not to blame yourself, never that, but to get honest. Where did you learn early on that love has to be earned through constant effort? Where did you learn that inconsistency feels more like chemistry than steadiness does? Where did you learn that your needs are something to minimize so someone else feels comfortable enough to stay? Because often the people who fall hardest for avoidance are not simply unlucky. They are people who, somewhere earlier in life, learned that love comes and goes, that affection is conditional, that you have to perform, please, or prove your way into being chosen. And an avoidant partner, without either of you realizing it, becomes a perfect, painful mirror, reenacting a familiar ache that feels mistakenly like home. This is why the real transformation is not about learning how to finally get an avoidant to choose you. That is the wrong goal entirely. The real transformation is learning to recognize the difference between anxiety and chemistry. Because so many people confuse the two. Anxiety feels like obsession, like checking your phone every 4 minutes, like your stomach dropping every time they go quiet, like a high so intense it must mean something profound. Real connection, secure connection, feels almost boring by comparison at first, because it does not spike and crash. It feels calm. It feels steady. It does not leave you interpreting silence like a detective. It does not require you to shrink, perform, or prove. It simply feels like being able to exhale. And that is the love you are actually meant for. The love you deserve. The love that was always yours to have. Not the version where you are constantly earning your place at the table, but the version where the seat was already yours the moment you walked in. Not a love that keeps you guessing, but one that keeps its word. Not someone who chooses you only when it happens to feel safe and comfortable for them, but someone who chooses you consistently on the easy days and the hard ones, because that is simply who they have decided to be. So here's what I want you to walk away with today. You are not broken for loving someone who genuinely struggled to love you back the exact way you needed and deserved. You are not weak for staying longer than made sense because the cycle you were caught in was never a fair fight. It was built on chemistry that mimics real connection and on hope that mistook potential for reality. But now you know the difference. Now you know that an avoidance loyalty was never actually about you. It was about their own survival system running exactly as it was trained to. And you also know that your needs, your desire for closeness, consistency, and real emotional safety were never too much. They were simply never met by someone who could not yet meet them. So stop auditioning for love that should already be yours. Stop mistaking anxiety for chemistry and distance for depth. Be as loyal to your own peace as you have been to everyone else's comfort. Because the moment you decide that your needs matter exactly as much as anyone else's, the entire equation changes and you finally make room, real room, for a love that does not ask you to disappear in order to be kept. A love that stays without being chased, that shows up without being begged, and that never once makes you question whether you were worth choosing in the first place.